Hey friends, Alvin here. As part of our October Maximizing Ministry, we are looking at this idea of Generation Z and evangelism. And so we are grateful for Alpha Canada and for Barna for releasing their research in this 40-minute video that you're about to see. We actually here at the Youth Pastor Retreat had a chance to take a look at it and got into some neat conversations about where God might be taking this over the next few months. And so we encourage you to take a look at this. Tim Gonzalez, who's the Alpha for Youth National Director, he's going to be walking through a lot of this stuff. And I encourage you, at certain moments, there will be questions, to pause, reflect on the questions, and to keep going. And we invite you on October 26th at 7:30 p.m. or on Thursday, October 28th at 10 a.m. to join us on Zoom to talk through some of this stuff. And if you can't make it for that, then give me a call. I would love to find out more about how you might be seeing this in your ministry as well. And so we invite you to take a look and see, well, what does it mean for your students and youth to be reaching out to their friends? We look forward to seeing what your answers are.
Hey friends, my name is Tim Gonzalez and I'm the National Youth Director for Alpha Canada, and I'm so excited just to take a few moments to walk through our newly released research partnered in with Barna, and we're really excited to walk you through this today. You know, as we head into another unique season of youth ministry, many of us are feeling tired, discouraged, and maybe unsure about how to build youth ministries in this really unstable climate. Restrictions are constantly shifting, culture is always changing, and the question is, how do we disciple our students in some of these challenges, like the rise of mental health, cultural pressures, and formation? And then the question that we're asking today specifically is how do we approach mission in all of this? You know, is it possible to engage students in things like evangelism and mission and kingdom initiatives in this current cultural moment? And so we want to walk through this with you in a workshop type format to hopefully give us a greater understanding as a community and to better understand the culture that we're in, the students that we're working with. And the goal today is that we want to help equip, inspire, and support you in potentially starting some missional and evangelistic initiatives to set a new trajectory for your youth ministry when it comes to things like evangelism and mission with your students. So we're going to walk through some data. We're going to take a look at what this all means and hopefully set you up to build some initiatives in this coming youth season to help increase and elevate mission and evangelism in your youth group like never before. All right, let's jump into it. Let's see what we got. So first things first is I want to ask you the question, what is your current state of evangelism and mission? You know, how would you assess evangelism and mission in your youth group? How would you describe it? And then secondly is, how would your students define evangelism? If you were to ask them what they thought about evangelism, what would they say about it? Why don't you take some time and think about that and begin to process this and write these responses down. Next is we want to let you know that all of this research is available to you. We partner with Barna to produce this research. We interviewed just under 2,000 students across the country in all different faith traditions, even non-Christians, different ethnicities and social groups. And we're excited to launch this with you. And so you can pick up your digital copy or even a print copy by visiting the website. And we're really excited to give that to you. And then secondly, wanted to let you know we've partnered with the Youth Worker community to double down on this effort in this next season. We're actually going to be touring all over Ontario, Quebec, and the Eastern provinces to bring you some more insights to set the next trajectory of your youth ministry season. So you can check that out for more information. We're excited to partner with them. All right, let's do this. So first things first is we want to ask the question, you know, what do we do with data? And data is only as good as what we make of it, what we use of it. And so what we want to do is we want to turn data, what we know, what to ask, into insights and then into action. And we do this by a variety of ways, but I want to let you know this is kind of the trajectory of why we want to look at data and what is the point of it. And then the next thing is we want to answer the question, why data? Well, real quickly, here's a few thoughts on why we want to look at data. First is it helps us see any coming trends that we might be thinking through. You know, it gives us some forethought into what is coming towards us in this next season. Next is it really helps explain why something is happening. You know, what's the purpose behind things that are going on all around us? Next is it can really help us identify who our target audience is, you know, who we're actually working with, not just this broad category of Gen Z students, but specifically who they are, what are their challenges, and what is going on in their world. Not only that, but it heightens our awareness, you know, as we're researching this specific topic on the state of evangelism amongst Gen Z. All of a sudden now our awareness of this topic increases, which I think is really good. As well, many of you are going to have some hunches around this data. And some of this data is actually going to validate your insights and your hunches. And it'll be something that you can point to in your further initiatives, projects with your elders and your board and your youth leadership teams. And this could really help validate some of those insights you already have. Not only that, but it also gives us authority and confidence when making tough decisions around what to do in our youth ministry season. And then as well, it gives us some evidence around movements that are starting amongst students. And then most importantly is I think it really corrects some of the misconceptions that we might be considering. But all that to say, I think it's really important that we realize that we need to be data informed and spirit led. You know, we're not just a group of people that takes a book, takes a manual, and just says what it does. No, that really informs us. But at the end of the day, we're spirit-filled Christians who believe that God is building his church. And so we want to take that data, we want to take what the Holy Spirit is saying, and we want to be led by him, partner with him, join him in building our youth ministries and our churches. And so that's what today is all about. I don't want you to think that it's just about doing what the data says, but it's also about being informed and then leaning into what the Spirit is calling us into. All right, so here's some thoughts. As you take this data, I want you to think about some principles on what to do with it. First things first is when you look at data, it's important that you work with your team. You know, as your team builds these initiatives from the ground up, it will create a much greater buy-in than you just coming and saying, hey, heard this stat from Tim from Alpha, and we need to change everything, and this is what we got to do. No, I think what you build together as a team is essential, especially in this unique season. Not only that is that context matter. You know, for many of you, you come from really unique contexts. You're working with totally different groups of students in totally different settings. And as you see this data and you take it for face value and you begin to apply new initiatives into your unique context, it's important to realize that this is not a one-size-fits-all scenario. Take your insights and think about where you're at specifically in your context and begin to work these things into a context that makes the most sense for you. Thirdly is contribution matters. Is each of us has a unique talent and gift and calling. And in this specific setting, even as you work with other youth pastors in your network and in your region, don't be afraid just to own the fact that God is inviting you to respond in a unique and gifting way that is unique to you. And don't be afraid to lean into that. And then lastly, time matters. You know, some of the best things in life really take time to work through and to process and pray into. My encouragement to you is that this would actually develop into a multiple layered, tiered process for you to consider. That you don't just take everything and just begin to do things, but that you really prayerfully process and work through this in a timely fashion in order to really get the fullness of what God might be inviting your youth ministry into. All right. Lastly, I want to invite you into an exercise, and it will be attached to this video that will be handed into you. Is as we look at the data, one of the most important things we can do is actually ask the question, what's the main problem that we're trying to solve here? This data is going to address several different problems, a whole bunch of different challenges. But only you have a unique problem and challenge. And so this little exercise, I think, is a helpful way to maybe incorporate with your team, maybe even right now where you're at, to actually look at this, to define your problem in order to actually figure out what the right bullseye is. And so this is an activity of actually framing the right problem to develop initiatives that are solving very specific problems. And so it's really simple. We start by just looking at what are the symptoms that you're observing right now. You know, what are the things that you've noticed that are current challenges or unanswered questions that you're currently facing as a team. And then what we want to do is, as we look at these symptoms, is we want to begin to ask the question, what's causing these symptoms? You know, what are some of the things that students are experiencing right now? What might be the root issue of why those things are? And then as we dig a little bit deeper, we broaden the scope by asking, is there any data that we can pick up on to affirm some of our assumptions around the causes? You know, do you have some interviews with your students? Have you done a survey with your parents? Do you have some other pieces of polling information or census data or any stories or even anecdotal things that have happened that can really affirm some of your assumptions around this data? And then from there, we begin to frame the problem. This is a simple statement that you can basically just copy and paste and begin to frame a problem statement that gives you a really clear bullseye to develop some initiatives. All right, so from there, let's jump into it. Our first piece of data that we want to take a look at is a really interesting piece. You know, the first idea that we look at in the journal is that nearly half of Gen Z prefer to have faith conversations in person. And when we think about this piece of data, the thing that we're trying to get at here to understand is, in a COVID reality, or maybe even a post-COVID reality, is do all students want to live online and have all of their big discussions online? Well, what we're seeing is it's kind of mixed reviews. You know, not all of the big questions, not their entire community and sense of belonging is digital. I think sometimes Gen Z gets mistyped, you know, as these digital natives, meaning all they want to do is be online. And I think to a degree that might be the case for some of them. But I also think for the most part, there's a lot of them that are asking the question, you know, I've got big questions in life and I don't want it to just be online. I want to do this with real people. I want to create spaces to actually interact with people. And so part of this might likely be due to Zoom fatigue and all of the online spaces that they're always in. But I want you just to consider, you know, what does it look like for, yes, us to do digital things, Discord groups, social media groups, Facebook chats, whatever you're doing. Yeah, that's important. But are we also creating in-person expressions of belonging and connection around faith conversations? You know, we saw huge success with Alpha Online happening, but we've also continued to see a lot of students hungry to be in person. And I've been amazed at, obviously, all these restrictions are challenging for youth ministries in this time, but I've been amazed at the stories of students flooding into youth groups, wanting to be together, wanting to be in person. It's really interesting. All right, next up. 79% of students agree that having a conversation about faith is most effective when you already have an established and significant relationship with that person. And so what we're seeing here is that traditional forms of evangelism, like going out on the street to strangers, is not only difficult for students today, but it's also kind of uncomfortable with them. It might be due to the fact that there's a lot of cultural pressure and marginalization towards Christianity. But it also might just speak to the fact that students have such a high value for relationships in this season. You know, they really want to know people and be known. And so when they're talking about evangelism, the best way that they think about doing it is in an already established relationship. And I think this is beautiful. I think this is something that we can actually leverage and encourage students in this idea that friendships actually matter, that they're important, and how you are a good friend is important. And it's a key topic on their mind and in their hearts. All right, next up. Many Christian Gen Zs, 44%, view that it is wrong to share one's personal belief with someone of a different faith in hopes that one day they'll share the same faith. This is super interesting. It's been a polarizing conversation as we've looked at this piece of data. But I think the crux of it is that traditional forms of evangelism around conversion, I think what they're saying, it's just not their main goal. And what's fascinating is recently we just did a national study with church leaders specifically. And the data showed similarly to pastors across Canada even. You know, it could be due to a few factors, a skepticism towards Christianity and evangelicalism. But I think also there's this idea that students are living in a tension of their actions and their words, and the disconnect, the hypocrisy of our culture, and some of those challenges behind that. And so they're saying, hey, when you're trying to just convert somebody, there's something that is a little bit iffy about that. The motivations aren't the best. And so I think we have to help students live in the tension of a gospel articulated and a gospel incarnationally lived out. You know, how can students actually live it and articulate it? And I think we need to see both of those taught and demonstrated in our youth ministries. Next is that when it comes to conversations about faith identity, half of the teens agree that the best outcome would be for both individuals to better understand the other person's point of view. You see, teens seem to show a bit of an indifference to evangelizing in some of these traditional senses. And instead, they see that sharing their faith is something that's relational, something that they want to do already with people that they know, as we mentioned before. And so students want to have these relational conversations where they really fully understand other people's perspectives. And I think that's amazing. I think it really challenges us to consider, you know, are we creating spaces for genuine questions where students are being trained and equipped not just to articulate their personal beliefs, but where they actually know how to ask really good questions and then to listen with empathy. Listening seems to be such a high value for these students. It seems to be something that is imperative in their process as they're thinking through things like evangelism. They want to actually not just say things, but they want to say, hey, what's going on in your world? Tell me what you believe. And I think that's amazing. And so where are the spaces in our youth ministries for mutual dialogue? Where are you creating opportunities for discussion where students can actually begin to practice listening really well, not just articulating their points of view? And I think this is perfect. You know, I think we're in a cultural moment where your opinion is everything. It trumps everything. And so when we're seeing students that are saying, actually, I think we need to be better at listening, I think there's something beautiful there, and I think there's an opportunity for a gospel of listening that can be created and demonstrated with our students. All right, next up. Half of Gen Z have talked about that when they're sharing their faith with somebody of a different faith, the number one feeling that it invokes is calmness. I thought this was so interesting, you know, when you would, you know, potentially talk to somebody of our generation or older, this idea of sharing your faith with somebody that definitely has a different point of view. You know, a lot of us, we wouldn't feel calm. We would maybe feel triggered or anxious or fearful. But for these students, awkward and calm seem to be kind of some of the main things that they feel when it comes to sharing their faith. And I just thought that was so amazing. I thought that was so interesting. And I think what it does for us is it makes us realize that we have an opportunity to help students realize that there's kind of like a non-stakes spiritual conversation that is available for students that doesn't trigger them, that doesn't bring up the fears and misconceptions and anxieties of previous generations. There's an organic, healthier view to evangelism, potentially, maybe. And so how do we create spaces for students to actually be calm and actually lean into these conversations? What are those spaces? You know, what are some of the tools that you're using to actually leverage their disposition of being calm around faith conversations? Because they're ready for it and they're open and it makes them feel calm. Next is a really fascinating one that I think has all sorts of really interesting implications for us. When it comes to Canadian Christian teens, they believe that the way that they live their life should be the primary witness to non-Christians. Almost 47% of them say letting your actions speak rather than using words to explain your faith is an act of evangelism. It's really interesting, and it kind of speaks to the previous sentiment of them feeling like the best outcome is both people being heard. But I think what I'm noticing in this concept is this idea that Christian teens actually desire to have a faith that is tangible, that is action-based. Not just a head knowledge, but also to see their hands engaged. Christian teens want a faith that is demonstrated in how they live their life. Many of them maybe are even tired of a Christian faith that is exempt of action. You see, they see Christian leaders around the world talking about all these important issues, but then they see a very massive lack of action in Christian realm and outside that. And so students are asking the question, I think they're asking the question is not just is Christianity true, but is it good for my life and the rest of the world? Does following Jesus actually make the world a better place? Does it impact my neighbor? Does it impact the refugees around the world? Does it impact the climate? Does it impact social issues? And so this generation, I think, just doesn't want to hear a gospel. They want to experience a gospel. They want a gospel that can actually apply to real world issues, that actually has power, that actually has effectiveness into some of the things around us. And what we've noticed as we dug a little bit deeper into this data is that young Christians, increasingly so, are feeling like the church is actually harmful to people, detrimental to society. And so as they see the church becoming more and more detrimental to things like the virtue of society, I think they're actually asking, what is going to be a faith that actually benefits the greater society? And I think this is a fair question. I think historically we learn as Christians that we should be salt and light, a city on a hill, a peculiar people that demonstrates a better way. And so how does our gospel articulation and our forms of evangelism actually promote a way that develops salt and light in a community, that shows people that Jesus is actually good for things like social change and reform in the world around us? And so what does that look like for us in our youth ministries? All right, next up. When it came to following up and faith sharing was more than a one-time thing for teens. Over 47% of students said that they followed up to ask more questions. And not only that, but 46% of the non-Christian students actually followed up with their Christian friend to ask more questions. And increasingly so, it turned out to be more of an ongoing conversation. And so I love this. I think what we're seeing is that when it comes to spiritual conversations, it involves some sort of follow-up. It involves more than a one-time thing. And I think this is the dream for a lot of us in youth ministry, isn't it? That it would be more than just a one-time event for our students. That we would find a way for students not just to invite their friends to put a hand up, but an opportunity for our students to actually journey with their friends, to journey with them, to disciple them, to journey alongside of them in their questions and doubts and conversations. And that this would actually integrate into a disciple process, not just a one and done moment. That we would see integration between discipleship and evangelism. And I think our students are saying that, hey, I want to stick it out with my friends. I want to have the hard conversations, and I want to do it over a long period of time. And I want to be a good friend to them and lean into these questions that they have. And so what does that do for our youth ministries when it comes to, events and gatherings? How do we help our students actually train and equip them to have several conversations with their friends, to actually work into their life an integrated discipleship approach and how they're reaching and serving their friends? Next up, what was really cool is after faith sharing, over 73% of students felt more confident in their faith, and 52% were eager to share their faith again. And I love this. I think a lot of the data over the last few years would really affirm this idea that when students engage in mission, it solidifies their faith, whether it be an overseas missions trip or whether it be something in their localized setting in their own city. But even in this act of sharing their faith with their own friend, it does something for them. And you're all smart. You don't need to do the math. You don't need to problem solve this reality. We just know this to be true. That when we engage in acts of mission, when we have conversations with our friends, causes us to think about the questions we're asking, causes us to think about what we believe. It causes us to even ask the question, can I trust God? Is he really going to be good or leave me hanging here? Can I really believe that he's invited me to join him in his mission? And what do I do about that? How do I actually partner with him? Man, this is going good or this is going bad. And it evokes and bubbles up all different sorts of discipleship things in our own life as we're disciples of Jesus. I'll never forget the story of a young student who was so confident and excited about sharing his faith with his friends through running Alpha. And almost a week before the running of Alpha, he emailed his pastor and said, "Hey, I don't think I can do this. I struggle with pornography." And I thought that was just so fascinating. You know, when we engage in elements of mission, it actually develops more of a resilient faith because it bubbles up so many different insecurities, challenges that we're feeling, our temptations, our desires for pride or even to underachieve and pull back and think about how insignificant we are. All of these get bubbled to the surface as we engage in acts of mission and evangelism. And I think it's really important. You know, David Kitteman in his book, Faith for Exiles, talks about five definitions of forming resilient disciples. And one of the things in the bottom there is number 5 is that in order to curb entitlement, which is a massive challenge in our generation, and self-centered tendencies, we help students engage in countercultural mission. You know, countercultural mission meaning proclaiming the gospel, demonstrating the gospel, engaging as a faithful presence by trusting God's power and living differently from the cultural norms. And so we want to help our students form resilience in their discipleship. Next up is that when it comes to having someone disagree with their faith beliefs, 82% of students don't feel judged. This is so interesting. That when students are in conversations about sharing their faith, they don't feel judged when someone disagrees with them. And this was so fascinating for me because when I think of this cultural moment, all of us just feel like we have this like low grade edge of being judged and persecuted because somebody commented on our belief statement or political view on Facebook. But Gen Z, it's not the same. They just don't feel judged when it comes to people disagreeing with their faith points of view. It's not triggering. And so I think this actually invites us to consider things like how do we actually help students lean into faith conversations, because there's already this disposition that it's okay if people don't agree with us. That it's okay if there's pushback or there's challenging conversations, because I think from this data we're seeing that students don't feel judged when their friends disagree with them. And I think that's beautiful. I think it invites us to consider that our students might have a bit of potential to be a non-anxious presence in tough conversations, in places of conversations that are difficult to swallow for some of us. When people push back or disagree, it can be so triggering. But for our students, maybe it's not the case for them. Isn't that amazing? Couldn't that be incredible and a beautiful opportunity for us? Next up, as we lean into what we want to do about this, we begin to see this reality that is a little bit tough to swallow. When it came to training, only 16% of students say that they have been trained in the areas of evangelism. This was a bit of an interesting one, because we had a hunch. Part of the reason why we did this survey is because we kind of had a feeling that a lot of students this day are not being trained in the area of evangelism. I mean, it might even be one of those things where the word evangelism isn't even used in many of our youth groups. And so we're not talking about it. We're not training students in it. We're not equipping them with the right tools and giving them opportunities to do it. And so it's no wonder that this is a bit of a declining idea. This idea of making disciples, proclaiming the gospel, joining in God's heart for mission. And so as we see that many students weren't being trained, we begin to kind of realize that part of our lack of effectiveness might be due to this. Not only that, is if you dug a little bit deeper in this data, is we saw that some of the main ways for training students that was listed in the report was things like a class or practicing with other Christians. And so the concept of actually experiencing and seeing true, evangelism or conversations with non-Christians, that training element and practice actually never really happened for the most part in some of the existing training settings. And so the question is, what does training look like? Are we talking a classroom, or are we talking a little bit more of an incarnational view of this, more of a relational perspective? I don't know. That's up for us to talk about, and for you to discern what it looks like to train students in the work of evangelism. But without a doubt, we have to realize that Jesus modeled and trained this idea of apprenticeship. That's what a disciple was. And when I think about it, I reflect even on my own story. In high school, I was told by my pastor something that we all do: pray for your friends. And for so many years, I had my token non-Christian friend, Corey, and I had his name written on a card, and I would pray for him, every week. God, would you come and move in Corey's life? Would you reveal yourself to him? Would you show him that you love him and that he would see that he's known? And, I'd pray for him all the time. Well, fast forward 10 years later, and Corey gets engaged to a Christian girl, and they ask me to marry them. And a week before the wedding, she calls me in tears and says, I can't marry Corey because he's not a Christian. And my heart just sank, and I'm like, gulp. I'm like, man, this is a tough conversation. And so I said, hey, let's all meet together in my office. Corey shows up to my office with his fiance already there. She's in tears, and he walks in the door. I'm like, oh man, this is so tough. This is so awkward. Corey sits down, and I just said, hey, to his fiance, hey, why don't you share why we're here? And she begins to open up about her challenge and how she's afraid of marrying a non-Christian. And I'll never forget, Corey looked at me just with this kind of piqued curiosity and confusion, and just says, I don't really know how to become a Christian. Oh man, the conviction that I felt in that moment. For 10 years I had been praying for Corey, but I'd never really known how to lead Corey to Christ or whatever that meant. I didn't know how to ask him about what he thinks about God and pray with him or share the gospel with him. And that's okay, and it's not a slam to my youth pastor by any means, but I've been there. I get it. We want our kids to reach their friends, but we actually don't have the tools on how to do that. And so we need some tools. We need training. None of these are silver bullets. None of them are perfect models or methods like Alpha. It's not a perfect thing. But we need something. We need to help our students. And I think it's actually kind for us to, the moment we say, go reach your friends, to also help them do it. To not just send them out and say, go reach your friends and just invite them to youth as if that would suffice. But to also think through some of the hard things, like how do we help our students ask good questions, listen really well, pray for their friends, rely on the Holy Spirit, have good dialogue, and yes, even articulate the gospel. How has Jesus impacted their life? How can they write out their story? All those things are important when it comes, I think, to training students in the way of evangelism and mission. All right, here's some crazy good news. Half of non-Christian Gen Z students have unanswered questions about faith. 23% are somewhat open to the Christian faith, and 45% say that they turn to their family to help about questions that they have about faith. I want to quickly touch on 1 and 3 and then close out with point 2. First, I think it's so fascinating that today's students would openly admit that they still have questions about faith. I mean, we have the internet, for goodness sake. They can literally Google any question they have and can come up with millions of answers and websites and YouTube videos and forums to answer their questions. But it hasn't sufficed for students. They still got questions. They're still wondering. And point 3, for a lot of our non-Christian students and even our Christian students, the primary place that they're still looking for answers isn't even online. It's actually family members. And this was so fascinating to me. I think, to me, not to share too much of my opinion or ideas, but just partly just to say that I think there's an opportunity to still talk about the ministry of family. You know, parents dialoguing with their kids, working through discussions and questions, and working through big topics like faith and life and God. I think there's a lot of opportunity for us to help train parents in the way of conversation with Gen Z. Because I think that students deep down, according to this data, are still wanting to ask questions with their family members. And so what does it look like for us to help families understand that they can still be a place of dialogue around faith conversations? And then last but not least is that as we look at this data, 23% of non-Christian Gen Zs are at least somewhat open to the idea of the Christian faith. I think this is a staggeringly hopeful piece of data. You know, a lot of us would say that, man, if we flip this to be 77% are just not open to Christianity, that might sound dismal. But I think the reality that 23% of high school students in Canada today are open to the gospel gives us this massive vision to say there's an incredible opportunity that equates to approximately 690,000 students in Canada right now are open to having conversations about life and faith in God. That yes, Christianity is becoming increasingly hostile in a secular, Western, pluralistic society where you can believe whatever you want. But the reality is that there's still a massive chunk. And I think it's just so true. You know, John 4, Jesus tells us that the harvest is ripe. And I think it still is. And so we need to pray to the Lord of the harvest for more young harvesters, that each and every single day that as they walk their schools, there's not a vision of saying, man, secularism is out to get me and nobody wants to listen to what I have to say. The hope of the gospel has no power in this moment. No, friends, that's not the case today. Is each and every day our students are walking the hallways, that 1 in 4 that they bump into almost is open to a conversation about faith. And not only that, but open potentially to a Christian worldview. And I think this is incredibly hopeful. That students are in this place and ready and poised to engage with the lost, to have conversations about faith, and to actually create spaces for dialogue. If we think about just training and equipping them, I think we would begin to see just a massive renewal and resurgence of young people reaching their friends, helping them make disciples who make disciples. Friends, I actually think it's a hopeful scene. I actually think that we're in a moment that high school students like never before are ready to engage in acts of evangelism. We just need to reframe it for them. We need to redeem it for them. And that's on us as their primary shepherds and pastors and leaders in their lives, to let them know the hope of the gospel is ever more present and ever more powerful for this cultural moment, and specifically for their friends. And to let them know that they have friends that are ready and waiting for them to be bold, to have a courageous conversation with humility and kindness about what Jesus has done in their life. So, why don't you take a few moments, think about these questions. What stands out to you? What should be highlighted? What should kind of have a spotlight on it? What pieces of data need a little bit more digging, a little bit more understanding to discover a little bit more? And then which pieces of data need to be adapted, challenged, embraced, or maybe even ignored in this season? And then maybe you can consider some of the initiatives that you can do that maybe could address that problem statement that you've been processing. Remember, we want to take data, turn them into insights, and move them into action. Don't let this be just some pieces of stats and data. Let this actually turn something in your ministry. Let this increase the temperature of evangelism and mission in the work that you are doing. And I'm convinced that you'll have some students that are ready to go, that are fired up, ready to engage in mission, both with their head, their heart, and with their hands. Trust me, friends, I think we're in for an exciting day. I want to remind you, you can pick up a full copy of this journal over at alphacanada.org. And then not only that, one of the best ways that I think we could really consider creating spaces for conversation in this current moment is through that of running Alpha. Maybe you've run Alpha before and you kind of viewed it just as curriculum. That's okay. But I think we're in a time where we want to continue to encourage you to consider that students are the best to reach their friends, and there's tools that we can put in their hands to help them create conversations about life, faith, and God. And Alpha is one of those tools right now that we're seeing just massive growth around student-led Alphas, because students want to have conversations and they want to learn how to articulate the gospel, and they want to see God's Spirit move in power amongst their friends. And so reach out, let me know if you've got any questions, but we're really excited to see what God's going to do. My prayer for you in this season is that you would not fear, that you would have hope, and that Christ would invite you into a mode of making disciples who make disciples, who join with Christ in seeing the renewal of all things. All right, bless you, friends. Thanks for the time.